Hello and welcome to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and each show I bring to you an interesting and provocative scholar to discuss topics in social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you enjoy what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. Hey everybody, and welcome to Ideas Having Sex. I'm Chris Kaufman, and today I am joined by philosopher James Otteson, and we are discussing his book, Honorable Business, A Framework for Business in a Just and Humane Society. And James is a returning guest, so check out his previous episodes. But James, thanks for joining me once again.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So this is a book on business ethics.
Yes.
And this is in the genre of applied ethics, is that correct?
I suppose that's right. Yes, that's not ethical theory so much, but instead trying to figure out what the implications of ethical theory are for particular areas, in this case, business.
Yeah. So you might see books in like bioethics or something like that. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's not a topic I've read much in generally, business ethics in particular, or applied ethics in general, I think. Maybe I have, I'm not sure. But so how does your book here differ from typical treatments of this topic of business ethics in particular?
That's a great question. So the business ethics discipline, so what's called business ethics, is a discipline in business. So almost every business school has a business ethics class or various courses, and usually they have a requirement for taking a business ethics class, at least at the undergraduate level, sometimes also in the graduate levels, the MBA programs, et cetera. So it is its own recognized discipline. It has its own journals. But when I first started teaching, was first asked to teach a business ethics course, I looked at the syllabi from other professors, both at my institution and other institutions who teach these courses. And one of the things, I was a bit surprised at what I discovered. One of the things that I discovered was that, on the one hand, many of the courses were really more about compliance than ethics. So there was, what are the regulations in place, or what are the laws, or, what's the government oversight that's in place? And so some of the business ethics courses tended to be more about being compliant, and then maybe also being a nice person on top of just being in compliance with the regulations. That was one kind of class. But on the other hand, and more common, I think, was what I would describe as something like a murderer's row of bad actors. So you would have these case studies of people who did bad things in business. So you would look at Enron and look at what those guys did and decide, yeah, those guys were terrible. And then you would move on to Bernie Madoff and look what he did, and wasn't that terrible? Yes, that was terrible. And you just sort of move through these various bad actors. I suppose soon we're going to be having case studies of Sam Bankman-Fried or Elizabeth Holmes, and they will be the next in the series of bad actors. What surprised me about that was that it wasn't clear to me what point that was supposed to make exactly. So, are there bad actors in business, or have there been bad actors in business? Yes, sure. Of course, there are and have been and will be in the future. But there are bad actors in every walk of human life. I mean, anywhere you have human beings, you're going to have some bad actors. So I didn't think that particularly by itself marked out business as making it any different from anything else. Do you have bad actors in government or in religions or in the professoriate? Of course you do. So what I thought might be more instructive to students, and really it might resonate with them more, is rather than just looking at all the ways that business can go badly, or the ways that people in business can behave badly, ask the question, kind of flip that a little bit and ask the question, is there some way to do well in business? In other words, can you be virtuous in the activity of business itself? And, in teaching my own business ethics courses, that's how I framed it. I asked this question, could there be such a thing as honorable business? And if so, what exactly would that be? And how could one strive to integrate virtue both in your personal life and in your professional life? And what would that look like exactly? And so that's what organized my courses on it, and eventually gave rise to this book that I wrote, the one we're talking about, called Honorable Business. That's where the title comes from. It's an attempt to explain how a person might be, on the one hand, virtuous and striving for a virtuous life, and at the same time engaging in business in a commercial society or in a market economy.
Do you think that the existing books in the business ethics field, and like maybe business departments in general, do you get the feeling that they're almost
that they're like apologizing for what they're doing? Is there like embarrassment at being in business, like it's something that needs justification and couldn't possibly be a good thing?
Yeah, I think there is something to that. To generalize a bit, I would say that there is a pretty prominent strain of thought that, well, business is at best a necessary evil, but it's still evil. So a lot of business ethics is really, by contrast with, say, bioethics. So in bioethics, the approach tends to be something like, well, you have medical technologies and medical treatments and maybe, various things in the offing in the future that we might be able to do with genomes or treatments or, nanobots, and you can imagine all kinds of things. But the approach seems to be in bioethics that these things in themselves are relatively neutral. They're tools that are neutral. They can be put to good or bad uses. So the questions are, well, what would be the good uses to which they can be put or the bad uses, et cetera? But in business ethics, there seems to be something of a presumption of negativity, meaning that the people who write about business ethics seem to assume that there is something sort of inherently morally suspect about it. And I'll give you just one example of that. Think of the very prominent saying that people have, and you've heard it, I'm sure, about giving back to society. So businesses or business people need to give back to society. Once you've been successful, you need to give back. And there is sort of this view that a lot of, especially young people have when they're thinking about going into, say, finance. They imagine that, well, I'm going to make a lot of money. And then once I've made a lot of money, then I'll give back to society, give to charity, et cetera. But if you think about that idea of giving back, people don't say that businesses or business people should give. They say they should give back, which is a subtle but I think important difference. It suggests that, if you think about other cases, if your mother said to you when you were a kid, well, hey, you need to give that back. What does that mean you did? That means you stole something or you took something that didn't belong to you, and now you need to make up for that. You need to atone for it as if it were a sin. And I think a lot of people approach business like that if you're successful in business, maybe we don't know exactly what you did wrong or exactly, where or when you did whatever your malfeasance is, but somewhere along the road, you must have done something wrong in order to be successful in business. And so now you need to make up for it somehow. So I think there is that kind of presumption of negativity about business, that success in business necessarily includes engaging in some either morally suspect or maybe outright immoral behavior. And so what a lot of business ethics literature is about is exposing the various ways that people engage in nefarious business activity, and then recommending various kinds of controls and restraints to channel business or to enable us to get the good, whatever the goods and services out of business we can get, but while minimizing its negative impact on society.
So what do you think should be our presumptive perspective on business? That it's presumptively negative, less negative, neutral, or even presumptively positive?
I would say presumptively positive. And admittedly, that's, me trying to, as it were, bend the stick backwards so that it can get back to, being upright. But, if you just look around the room where you are now, or any of your listeners, if you just look around the room, probably literally everything you see in every direction was provided by business. So everything from the clothing you wear to the electricity you have and the air conditioning, if you have air conditioning, to the building and construction materials of your office or your house, to the food you eat, all of it was created by business. And I think if you think, once you begin realizing that all of these things, these goods and products that we buy, we sell, we trade, we enjoy, were created by business, that to me suggests that there should be a presumption in favor of these things, because many of these things have made our lives much better. And if you just think about, over the last couple hundred years or so, the amount of wealth and prosperity also in goods and services that has been created over the last 200 years has risen to levels that humanity has never seen before, which means that our lives today are, whether measured in terms of longevity or access to healthcare and potable water and good foods and services and technologies, we live a life now that is vastly better than what the majority of humanity has had over its history. And so those to me suggest that there should be a presumption that, well, maybe there is some good going on in business. And yes, there are people who go astray and who commit fraud and various other things, and we should be vigilant about that. But the presumption, if anything, I think should be in favor of what I call honorable business.
Can you summarize the main outline of your code of business ethics?
Yeah, well, I mean, I want everybody to buy the book. It's a whole book. But
Give a
yes,
teaser.
so yes, I'll give you a teaser. So a short teaser is, if you think about if somebody else has something that you want, there are, two ways that you can get it from that person. You can either steal it from that person, maybe kill them, defraud them out of it, steal from them when they're not looking. That's one way of getting something from somebody else. Another way of getting something from somebody else is to make them an offer to trade or exchange or partner that they are free to accept or decline. Now, if you ask which of those two ways, if you call the first one extraction and the second one I call cooperation, which of those two ways is morally preferable? Well, clearly it's cooperation. And which of those two ways leads to an overall increase in well-being or prosperity? It's also cooperation, because those are positive sum transactions as opposed to zero sum or even negative sum transactions. So what I suggest honorable business is taking positive action to seek out ways of engaging with other people that lead to positive, cooperative, positive sum transactions. In other words, seeking to benefit yourself, but only at the same time benefiting other people. So, there are definitely many ways to do that, but I think the honorable business person is the person who wants to use his or her unique set of skills and abilities on the one hand, but also opportunities on the other, to figure out how can I improve my own situation by improving the situations of other people. In other words, creating genuine value in the world, not just for me, but for others as well.
What is your view of business ethics? How does it incorporate concerns around distributive justice, if at all?
So, one of the arguments that I make sort of a bit indirectly in this book, I've made it more directly in other places, but a bit indirectly in this book, is that, there are various kinds of social institutions like medicine, like business, like maybe, institutionalized religions, et cetera, that are developed by people usually in order to do something specific. So, we typically don't ask, for example, or well, maybe today it's a bit different, but we haven't historically typically asked, what's the social responsibility of science? Now, why wouldn't we ask that? Well, because science is attempting to understand the truth of the world and, figuring out the utility or the disutility of different truths that we might discover about the world seems to be in the purview of other disciplines, not science itself. I would say something similar about business. Its responsibility typically, or if you pick any particular firm or any particular business, usually its goal is to provide some good or service that somebody else is willing to sacrifice some aspect of their wealth or their resources in order to obtain. It's not to solve all problems. It cannot solve all problems. Business is a powerful tool, but it's not a universal tool that does everything. So when we think about distributive, maybe the overall distribution of resources in society, that may or may not be a problem. So people argue about the extent to which that is a problem or what kinds of consequences that has for society. I'm not sure is specifically businesses' responsibility to worry about that, even if it's the responsibility of, say, business people or human beings as moral beings to worry about that.
Are other business ethics books or applied ethics books in specific fields typically as philosophical as this one? Do they typically attempt to delve into the grounding of the ethics that they're advocating?
Not, I mean, the short answer is probably not really. I think mine is a bit of an outlier in the extent to which it relies on philosophical argument. But that being said, most business ethics books and most business ethics courses typically introduce students or readers to three different schools of moral thought. On the one hand, they'll talk about utilitarianism, so maybe John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism as being one way to evaluate, different potential courses of action, what leads to the greatest net utility for all relevant persons. That's one school of thought. Different school of thought that's usually introduced comes from Immanuel Kant. It's called deontology. So maybe there are some rules or principles that an ethical person or an ethical business person must follow, maybe even regardless of the consequences. And then often it's just those two. If there's a third school of thought that's introduced, it will be something like virtue ethics. So maybe Aristotelian or from St. Thomas Aquinas, something about virtue. What does it mean to be a virtuous person? And to what extent can you be virtuous in business activity? Most coverages, both in classes and in books and literature of business ethics, will at least make reference to one or more of those schools of thought. One of the things that I think is sometimes, not always, but sometimes lacking in these treatments is they don't give you a clear way to adjudicate among those. So if utilitarianism tells you should do this particular thing in this particular situation, but Kantian deontology tells you should do something else, well, which should you choose? And that I think, a little bit more difficult for many students to try to figure out from these courses and for people who read the literature to try to figure out. It often seems as if it's just sort of left to your own preference. What appeals to you more? Do you like utility? Do you like deontology? Do you like virtue? Whichever of those appeals to you most, well, that's the one you should apply. So in my book, I try to be a little bit more systematic about figuring out what the sources of normativity or the reasons why we should do something, as opposed to just what are the consequences of adopting various perspectives. So I think my book does try to do a little bit more of that philosophical work than some other work in business ethics. And maybe for that reason makes it a little bit of an outlier in the general business ethics literature.
And I don't want to scare anyone away by referencing the philosophical nature of the book, because it's really entertaining and interesting, and I'm guessing much more fun to read than a typical applied ethics book.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Very readable. Jim is an amazing writer. So
Thank you.
for a little bit in the book, you avoid using the word capitalism, and you eventually kind of settle on eudaimonism as an alternative word to capitalism, or for what you're advocating. Is that right? Or can you talk about the distinction and how that fits in with the moral foundations you just talked about?
Yeah, that's a great question, very perceptive question too. So what I try to avoid in the book is, taking a particular position on what system of economics is the right one to have. As you or maybe others might know, I have talked about that in other places. Is capitalism the right system of political economy? Is socialism the right system of political economy? In this book, I try to take, to some extent, the system that we have in a generalized market economy, like the United States, for example, which is, certainly not a completely laissez-faire free market economy, but it's probably closer to that than a lot of other places. I try to ask the reader, well, if you find yourself thinking about starting a business or working in or for a business or with a business in a system like that, so something of a commercial society where there are wide and extensive markets for goods and services and also capital markets and other kinds of markets. If you find yourself in a situation like that, what kinds of behaviors, what kinds of activities do you think would be consistent with the moral goals you might have? So that's not saying, so I don't directly advocate in favor of or against capitalism, but you're right, I do talk about this notion of eudaimonia. So this is Aristotle's conception of the highest human good. It's often translated as happiness, something like happiness, but it's kind of a more profound notion than the English word happiness would suggest. That can mean, in English, happiness can mean contentment or pleasure or, lots of different things. But the idea from Aristotle, the way I adapt it anyway, is that, there is a certain kind of deep sense of meaning and purpose that you can achieve if you are using the skills, abilities, talents that you have in the service of goals that you think are important. So the question for business or people thinking about going into business or dedicating their lives to business, the question about that is that, well, if your ultimate goal is that kind of deep and profound sense of happiness, meaning a life well and fully lived, how can you do that in business? And so if you think it's possible in business, as I do think it's possible, then let's work out some of the consequences of that. What kinds of business behaviors would that rule out? What kinds of business behaviors would it rule in?
Hey everyone, this is Chris Kaufman, and I just want to let you know that each one of you are super special, precious snowflakes that I appreciate to bits for listening to my show. I love doing this show so much, but it is still a small show. And if you want to help me out a little bit, I would greatly appreciate it if you would just recommend the show to a friend, maybe two friends. But every little bit counts, especially when you are a small, new, and growing show, as I am. So if you want to help me out, that is the simplest thing you can do, and I will not bug you any longer right now. Back to the show.
You talk about, in your code of business ethics, you're advocating, and this is a fairly common sense idea, that as a business person, you should be looking for mutual benefit with your customers, with your contractors, whoever you're dealing with, that if you're interacting with each other, you're not defrauding them, you're not benefiting in a way that's at their expense, in a way that you know about and could avoid, and you're certainly not stealing from them. I guess I want to ask you an applied question about the business person's relationship to government. If you're a business person and let's say you're Apple and the NSA or something asks you to do something which is clearly against your user terms of service or something like that, or, put a backdoor in or spy on your customer's privacy or something like that, that's not something that you should do as a business person. I'm guessing you would say if the government asks you to do it, you should also decline. A more difficult question is, what should you do? What is the process of reasoning if you're being asked to do things that are maybe a little bit less direct violation of promises you've made to your customers? Like, businesses are frequently tapped to make enforcement easier for the government in a variety of ways. What do you think is the relationship between business and government when it comes to these kinds of mandates?
A hard and difficult question. So one of the main philosophical principles I argue for in the book is what I call the principle of equal moral agency, which I claim is the way we should think of not only ourselves, but of all other human beings. So what makes us unique and valuable as a creature on earth is that we are moral agents, able to think about our long-term goals, decide among the goals, and then develop plans to actually achieve our goals. And then the other piece of that, of being a moral agent, is not just that we can choose, but also that we are then responsible for our choices. We're accountable for our choices. If we could have said no to something or have done something else other than what we actually chose to do, then that means that we're actually responsible for the choices that we make. So being a free and accountable being is, I think, the right way to think about ourselves as moral agents, but it's also the right way to think about all other human beings. So that's what makes it an equal principle of moral agency. So I lay that out just a little bit because I think that gives me some guidance to answer the kinds of questions that you're asking, or might give a reader the kinds of at least some framework to think about these kinds of questions. So here's a heuristic device before we get to the NSA or the government asking us to do something that might be a little dubious. In general, when you're dealing with a potential customer or client, or maybe a partner or somebody you want to work with, how do you know that you're properly respecting their equal moral agency? Well, a heuristic device to give you a good indication of that is, well, imagine yourself on the other side of the deal. If you were in that person's position, knowing what you know, would you still think that this offer is a good offer? Would you still think this deal is a good deal? Would you still think this proposal is a good proposal? If the answer is yes, then that gives you not infallible certainty, but it gives you a pretty good sign that what you're thinking about really is mutually beneficial and really does respect the agency of the other person as well. If the answer is no, though, that's a pretty big red flag. So if you think, well, knowing what I know, if I were in the other person's shoes, there's no way I would do this, then that's a pretty big red flag. And almost always, if that's the case, you should say to yourself, then I don't want to make this offer or enter this deal, even if the other person says yes, because there must be something going on in that deal or whatever it is you're discussing or proposing that you know that the other person doesn't, and that actually, in your judgment, wouldn't actually benefit the other person in the way that you yourself would want to be benefited. So I think that heuristic can apply to cases like the NSA or to other government mandates or proposed mandates. If they come to you and say, well, we want you to do this. If you say to yourself, well, let me put myself in the shoes of my customers, of my clients, of my prospective customers or clients, or whoever the affected people might be, knowing what I know and what I'm being asked of, if I were in those people's shoes, what would I think? Would I think it's fine? Would I think it's a benefit? Would I be upset about it? And the answer to that question, I think, gives a pretty good indication of what you should say. Now, the world, Chris, the world's a messy place. And so it's very hard in particular cases, if you say, well, but, if the government comes to you and they're not really giving you an option, maybe they're going to figure out a way to shut your business down if you don't comply, or make it very difficult for you to continue existing as a business if you don't comply. Yeah, in cases like that, well, then I think you have to use your prudential judgment. But and maybe there are things that you have to do just to survive. And maybe there are things that really are for national security or something. If we don't do this, then maybe our great republic stands at the brink unless I give this information to, the NSA or whatever. If you actually think that, Okay, well, that's a pretty extreme and I hope rare case, but maybe in a case like that, prudence would suggest you do something that you wouldn't do in the 99% of your other cases when you're dealing with transactions in the market. But I still think that heuristic of putting yourself in other people's shoes and asking what they would think if you did what you're contemplating doing, that can give you pretty good and powerful reliance.
So you mentioned earlier that most business ethics books have a lot just on compliance, like, and
Yeah,
I assume you mean compliance with like regulations.
right, right.
But is it your view, given the kind of voluntarist nature of the ethics you're proposing, that it's acceptable or maybe even obligatory sometimes to not comply with certain regulations?
Yeah,
I know
so
that's a
that's
controversial application
yeah.
of your book, and that's not the main purpose of it, but I'm curious.
Yeah, and that maybe drifts a bit out of the business ethics realm per se, and maybe more into sort of moral philosophy or political philosophy a little bit more generally. But I am sympathetic to the argument. Well, I can make a sort of philosophical argument and then a kind of economic argument. The philosophical argument is that I am sympathetic to the idea that a great deal that there are many cases in which people are asked or told to do things by various agencies, and that could include, by the way, civic agencies or, sort of the not just the state, but other groups, powerful groups, social groups in your community or something. There are many times in which I think people apply rules and demand they will exact punishments for failure to comply with rules for no other good reason other than they are the rules, not because they actually lead to any kind of benefit for any party to those rules. And I think there are many cases like that where people should resist that. They should say, ask for some kind of demonstration along the lines of, well, if you're infringing on my liberty to do something, then you better have a pretty good reason and demonstrate to me what that reason is. Again, that's left to the matter of prudence. Sometimes that, you don't fight every battle, but some battles I think are worth fighting. But there is an economic argument. That's sort of a philosophical argument. I think there is an economic argument to make also, and I draw on a very short but really powerful and often overlooked claim that Joseph Schumpeter made in his Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy book way back from 1942. This is the book where he introduced this term creative destruction, where he says the essence of capitalism is creative destruction. One of the things he mentions in that book is that the competition that you get in a capitalist economic order, as he says, disciplines before it attacks. What he means by that is that the fact that there are other people who are trying to get your customers, who are trying to outcompete you on products, on people, on services, on everything, means that if you make a mistake, if you do treat people badly, if you mishandle something, if you don't make good on a promise, there will be somebody, or you underpay employees. There's a whole range of things. There will be somebody else who is going to seek to capture that value that you're leaving on the table. They're going to try to get your customers away from you. They're going to try to get your clients away from you. They're going to try to get your good employees away from you. And so what can happen in a competitive market is that there is a great deal of disciplining that goes on, and it can happen very quickly. In fact, often much more quickly than anything you would get through the cumbersome and bureaucratic regulatory process of waiting for legislation and agencies in Washington, D.C. to come up with rules. Very often people will try things and then the market will speak and they'll figure that out extremely quickly. Watch the stock price of any company and what happens when they make a misstep anywhere along the way. It happens like that. So that's a kind of discipline that I think can be extremely effective and is often underappreciated when our first instinct is to ask, well, what are the regulations, or to ask, let's get some regulations on the market. I think we often don't see that the market is already often regulated on its own by the competitive process itself.
Yeah, and even if something's not specifically happening, the constant potential is there. It's this like Damocles
Right.
sword that's constantly threatening established businesses, and whether it's the competition of a direct rival business or the competition of existing substitute businesses. I mean, maybe
Yeah,
there's not another
exactly.
shoe store that's popped up to compete with your shoe store, but if things get bad enough, people might start wearing different kinds of footwear, going barefoot or wearing sandals or something like that.
No, exactly. Exactly. And and new products and new services are coming into the world all the time. So it's not even thinking about, well, what are the currently existing alternatives? you're also, I mean, you said the sword of Damocles. Yeah, that's exactly right. You're also wondering, well, what's the next product that somebody's going to come up with out of their garage or wherever that's going to compete against me? And that has a way of focusing the mind, but B, also strongly aligning the incentives for people in business to taking care of their customers, their clients, their employees, their suppliers, and others.
What do you think is a common business practice in the modern world that is something that is ruled out by your code of business ethics?
That's a subtle question. So I'm going to give a controversial answer, if
Go
that's all right
ahead.
with you.
It's fine.
So many people who support a market economy or who support, business in a market economy, they focus on the idea of consent or maybe informed consent. In other words, if you and I are, two consenting adults and we agree to transact or exchange or partner for something, as long as we both consented, we're both adults, and neither of us was coerced or bullied or whatever, then whatever we agreed to, that's our business. And so there isn't anything else that anybody else is entitled to criticize us for. Other people can do other things, but as long as we agreed, then that's the end of the story or the end of the moral story. One of the arguments that I suggest in my book is that that's necessary but not sufficient. In other words, having the voluntary, informed consent of your partners, or whether for trading, exchanging, working for you, whatever it is, or working with you. Yes, absolutely, you have to have that, because the alternative is to have involuntary consent, which is not, that's immoral. Okay, so I think that's necessary, but I think there's another step. I think a lot of business activity adopts a kind of what I think of as a bastardized caveat emptor view, which is that, well, I'm making this product and you know what it is and you know what it does. And if you say yes to it, well, then that's on you. And so I didn't coerce you into it, but this is a voluntary exchange. So what I think is, if we're going to engage in honorable business, remember that heuristic I mentioned before, you still have to put yourself on the other side of the shoes, on the other side of the exchange, meaning if you don't think that this product that I'm making, if I don't think this product I'm making or this service I'm providing actually does benefit you. In other words, if I were on the other side, I wouldn't want it, or I wouldn't want it for my children, or I wouldn't want it for people I love or care about, then I think that also is ruled out by a conception of honorable business. In other words, that would mean saying no to many mutually voluntary transactions that might otherwise be justifiable on a kind of political position or political philosophy position. But I think there are some things you should just say no to. There are some products and services, and one big one, I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about this because it's a big Pandora's box, but social media. Social media in many ways is a force for good in many ways, but it also has a lot of negative repercussions. And so if I'm, providing social media for people and I see or come to believe that it's actually having a deleterious effect on people, then even if they're willing to pay for it and even if they're voluntarily willing to sign up for it, I think that means I still need to say no to it and not do it, find something else.
So I'm happy to talk about that. And I have two kind of follow-up questions about that.
Okay.
So one is, let's distinguish between whether or not you're saying that this is a matter of this would not be an honorable business practice to engage in, to sell a service, even if it's voluntary, if your honest belief is that it's not really good for the people you're selling it to. Saying that versus saying, let's say it should be illegal or prohibited or something.
So I'm in favor of having the default position be to allow things to be legal that are not clearly, as long as they're not violating people's persons, you're not killing people, you're not assaulting people, you're not forcing people, you get those kinds of things out of the way. That's all extraction. So I think the realm of the legal or illegal should be relatively small. But I think that opens up a space for us to actually exercise moral judgment about the kinds of products and services and exchanges and partnerships that we should be willing to take.
Okay.
So I'm not saying that there are plenty of things that I think should be legal, but that doesn't mean it's virtuous to engage in them or it's a good idea to engage in them.
And lest people, think that that's a contradiction or something, I think people who are not, sympathetic to laissez-faire as you are, this is a normal view to have. You use a great example to flesh out this intuition with romance, but like that, I think most people, here's a simple example. Most people would think that it should be legal to refuse to call your mom on Mother's Day and to be rude to your mother.
Yes.
Nevertheless, it's obviously a bad thing to do, assuming a nice mother who treated you well.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone thinks that should be illegal, but everyone thinks that it's probably wrong.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And I think there are a lot of things like that. Yeah.
yeah. So another follow-up question, and you brought up social media. I was going to ask this about cigarettes, and you could pick either one. And I'm
Okay.
sympathetic, by the way. I mean, I think my own relationship with social media is mixed at best, and I've recently purged most of it from my life.
Okay.
But so given your code of ethics, can you sketch out a way that a business might go about honorably selling or marketing something like social media or cigarettes or something that in some really big obvious way seems harmful? Is there any room for it, or what might that look like?
Yeah, let's start with, well, I'll say something about cigarettes. So cigarettes are, for me anyway, in a kind of, they're barely on the lowest threshold of worry because cigarettes can be addictive. I assume they are addictive. Nicotine is an addictive substance, but the kinds of consequences you can have from cigarettes, or specifically, I think, don't quote me on this, I'm not a doctor about this, but I think cigarettes are worse than, like nicotine patches and that kind of stuff. I think nicotine itself is a little bit easier to deal with, but even though it is still addictive.
Yeah, you're right about that.
Yeah. But the difficult issue with that is, on the one hand, it's addictive. And if you say something is addictive, then that seems to suggest that it's sort of robbing people of the ability to make free choices anymore. That's easier to see with much stronger drugs. If somebody's addicted to meth or something, or heroin, then you might make the case, well, they're not really free. I mean, it looks like people are freely choosing, but because they're so addicted that it's really robbed their ability to say no anymore. So that becomes I think that's probably a quantitative difference rather than a qualitative difference. Cigarettes don't seem as dangerous as meth or, heroin or something. But I think that the clearer case is when you're dealing with children. So if you're dealing with people who are not yet in full capacity of their ability to say yes or no, don't have full good judgment, then the answer is, then okay, don't market to children. But are you marketing your cigarettes to adults? I think that's much more defensible than it would be for children. But I think it's less defensible. It's also more defensible than it would be to have a business where you're selling meth to people or something. But that also connects to the other question of social media. I mean, I think, and again, I think the evidence is still coming in about this, but it looks like, maybe people can become addicted to social media, especially young people, in a way that's sort of similar, maybe even in their brain chemistry, sort of similar to the way they become addicted to other kinds of drugs. But use of social media, especially among teenagers, is highly correlated with all kinds of bad effects like anxiety and depression, clinical depression, suicide attempts, increasing. So those all look like very worrisome things to me. So your general question was, well, if you want to be a business, say you want to start a social media company or something, how would you do it honorably? I think the first thing to do is to have it be for adults. Doing it with kids, I think that's, extremely difficult. You have to be very careful doing it. And if there is evidence that comes out that this can be harmful to children, there is increasing evidence, maybe not fully, not decisive yet, but there's increasing evidence that social media has had a negative effect on children, then I think you need to immediately pull out and, err on the side of caution. Make it for adults, make it difficult, or, maybe not impossible. Nothing's impossible, but make it more difficult for children to access your materials, make it only for adults, or try to ensure that only adults engage in it. And I think that's the first thing to do. What's your view? So you, to some extent, live on social media, right? I mean, you said you got rid of a lot of social media, but here we are in a digital forum right now.
Yeah, well, so I mean, I guess it depends on how broadly you define social media. I mean, in the broadest sense, I think media that connects people can include a telephone call or something, I guess.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't have anything generally bad to say about it. And I don't have any particular explanation or story about why, but there's something about my relationship and the relationship I see with a lot of people with things like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, where it seems to be checked compulsively. And my constant relationship with it is one where it takes up a lot of my time and I'm enjoying it in bits and pieces, but it's often peppered with regret about how I'm spending my time.
Yeah.
And the overall picture is like, here's a decision I think is probably a mistake, and it's a mistake I'm making frequently. And it's, it's a similar relationship that I've had with cigarettes or substances or something like that.
Yeah. And it might be similar to it used to be with television. So,
Yeah.
people said the same thing when television came into existence, said, well, we're just going to sit there and look at it. I don't know if you're old enough to remember television being called the idiot box.
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
No, it is. And I think ultimately my relationship, maybe it's because I've been around those medias longer and I've figured out how to strike a balance, but my relationship with that kind of media is much more healthy. And I don't find that it's like, I don't have a lot of regret around, even occasionally when I watch a lot of TV, whereas I do with some other kinds of media. So I think it's difficult, but I also find that, like, to the extent that this is social media, I'm a podcast creator and I'm on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and YouTube or whatever. The only thing that sucks up my time, and I've also curtailed this, is sometimes getting a little bit compulsive about wanting to check my stats, how many people watched.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to give that up too. But the actual production of it and putting it out there, I find pretty rewarding and enjoyable. And I'm kind of optimistic about social media. I think that that people are going to develop better forms of social media that, even if they're not adopted by everyone, that thoughtful people can adopt. I think Substack is a much better form of social media for me, to the extent it's social media, than Twitter, because it's long form. I think long form things don't trigger the addictive side of my personality quite as much. But I think everything you said about how to go about it honorably sounds right to me. I mean, it may be that you can't do a business like that honorably, but I think if you're Twitter or Facebook, you can look for features that you would think, if I were engaging in this service, this is a feature that would ultimately make me feel better about using it. And I think there are such features. I don't know what they are, but I think some clever entrepreneurs will figure that out.
Yeah, I think you and I might be on the same page about that. I mean, and for the record, I should state that the content that you create is terrific. So I'm all in favor of your content. But I would say something else which connects a little bit to, something that we were talking about a little earlier, the difference between what's legal and what's moral. The fact that something might be legal doesn't necessarily mean it's moral. I think a lot of people conflate that in their minds. And when it comes to social media, especially with children, I would make the claim that parents need to assert their authority as parents much more than they do. Children, they don't have their own independent incomes typically. They aren't buying their phones for themselves, and if parents say, well, yeah, I know it's bad for my kids, but it's legal, so no, that's not what you say. You need to exercise independent judgment. And if you see that your children are being negatively affected by, well, anything in general, but specifically with social media, or maybe over access or overuse or over reliance on social media, if it's affecting their moods, their anxiety, causing depression, these sorts of things, that is the job of the parent to intervene. And if that means you take the phone away or you buy them an old style flip phone or something. I mean, I'm old enough, I grew up without a phone. I never had a phone. So, now everybody has a phone. And so how am I going to be connected to my friends without a phone? Okay, I accept that raises the cost of, limiting children's access to these kinds of things. But on the other hand, I think parents need to take control of that and rise to the expectations of their role. If your job is to protect and guide your children, well, then protect and guide your children. That's your job.
From what little I know about the technology, there is a lot of perfectly functional technology available that can give kids access to, some of what might be important for staying connecting with friends, while blocking or raising the cost of using other types of technology. And I think it's just a lot of parents regard it as too much trouble, either technically or time-wise, to actually figure that out. But it's there. A lot of it's there. It'll get more user-friendly, I hope.
Yeah, no, agreed.
So if you're a business and you're producing a product that you think predictably might have some of these consequences, I guess I'm wondering what kind of, I feel like there's probably got to be some moral threshold you reach as a business where you do your due diligence and you might say, like, this is a product that has real potentials for abuse and I'm not hiding them, and I'm even advertising them and doing my best to limit their use in this way. But otherwise, I still want to provide a service that is not actually being abused and mistreated by everyone. I mean, I assume some large chunk of people are just fine using social media, or
Yeah.
can, alcohol is maybe a good example. I've been sober for a long time. I can't use alcohol responsibly in general, but a lot of people can, and good for them, and I hope that the world isn't geared towards just people like me who struggle a lot with something, when a lot of people can go about their lives normally and be just fine. And if you, even if you predictably know that mistakes will be made, are you, can you do your due diligence as a business, knowing that people will abuse your product, but doing your best to try to minimize that? Is that acceptable under your view?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is, and in fact, I would say I'd probably even put it a little more strongly, because just about any good or service can potentially be abused. So you can do bad things with hammers and screwdrivers, but that doesn't mean we should ban hammers and screwdrivers. And the fact that if you are a manufacturing company making hammers and screwdrivers, or you reasonably know that at least some of these will be used to do bad things by somebody. I don't think that means that you then have to go and stop making them. Maybe one way to think about this is asking about, what is the purpose, or maybe the range of purposes for which my product or service is actually designed. So, what are the intended uses for these things? Not just what uses could they be put to, but rather what problem that people have am I looking to solve for them, or what difficulty am I looking to alleviate? And if your product or service is aimed at making people's lives, even incrementally or just marginally or something, a little bit better or a little bit easier, making something a little bit more, a little quicker, a little more efficient, a little better, then those are admirable, and I would say even honorable things to try to do. If by contrast, so the contrast class would be if what you're doing is designed and intended to lead to something that actually you think is either immediately or even in the long term negative, that's the things you say no to. And I think there are lots of times when business people do, and let's be honest, I think they do sort of close their eyes to that, and they say, well, it's not my business, and whatever you're going to do with this dangerous thing I'm creating for you, that's your business. No, I think an honorable business person should go into it with your eyes open. But the mere fact that something can be misused or abused by itself doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It should be, well, but is it designed and intended for something that would actually benefit somebody? That's the real question.
So I don't have a good example of a contrasting business ethics book, but I assume I know that you're familiar with other books. Can you give an example of some dilemma or problem that might be faced by a business person where your moral view would advocate a different set of options than a typical or a different business ethics book?
Yeah, I think the big issues that are talked about in business ethics today, for a long time, it was what was called corporate social responsibility. And that's still a large general topic. That's sort of morphed a little bit now into ESG, environment, social, and governance issues, as other things that businesses, including in particular for-profit businesses, publicly traded for-profit businesses, should be paying attention to, not just profit, but also the effects that they have on environment, society, governance, et cetera. The other big, huge one, and maybe will soon eclipse all the others, is sustainability, which is a general term that has to do with, the effects of a business on climate. I think one of the ways in which my position about honorable business might diverge from at least some other accounts, I'll mention something about sustainability, is that I put a lot more of the responsibility for making, let's say, sustainably responsible and sustainable choices on the consumer, on the person who's employing a product, than on a business that's offering a product. That doesn't mean that, it's a two-way street and it takes two to tango. So, there aren't products for you to use even unsustainably unless a company's making them. But I think most of the discussion puts basically 100% of the responsibility on business itself to make sure that, to whatever extent it's possible, or however you conceive it, that it's engaging only in, say, environmentally sustainable practices. But I think we should have a little bit of a shift. And so my suggestion is that every economic choice that we make or every choice we make in a market is itself a moral choice. So if you choose to buy this product, then that means you're responsible for that choice. And if you think that certain kinds of products or certain kinds of companies or maybe even certain industries are actually having a negative effect or a worryingly negative effect on, say, the environment, then that should be reflected in the choices you make, the economic choices you make, the market choices you make. If it's not, if instead what you're doing or the way you're trying to address that is by asking, say, for regulation or for laws to be imposed to place restrictions on businesses, then what you're effectively doing is creating an externality of your responsibility. You're saying, I have these principles, but the responsibility for them is somebody else's. If they're your principles, you should be responsible for them. So if you have views about the right kinds of labor practices or the right kinds of industries to engage with or their effects on the world or whatever, if you have moral views about those things and if they matter to you, then they should be reflected in your choices. So I think one of the things that my framework does refocus a bit is the attention on the individual person, on me, not the choices that I make. If I have moral commitments, then they should be reflected in the choices I make. If they're not reflected in the choices I make, then are they really my moral commitments?
Are there any areas of business that you regard as especially hard cases for your framework?
Yeah, things like the oil industry. The oil industry creates an enormous amount of value in the world. And I think, people on all sides of, of climate and others, the amount of value that, speaking about the oil industry generally, so everything, from plastics to gasoline to natural gas, all of it, it's an enormous amount of value. And on the other hand, it may be posing risks for us going forward, or maybe even currently posing risks. One of the difficulties for my view is that it's very difficult for a single individual person, consumer, or for even maybe one company, maybe less for an industry if you think of all of those companies in the oil industry as, an industry. But it's very difficult on the local level to make decisions that affect the macro level. So I could give up using well, it'd be very difficult. But if I decided I would try to give up all products that come from, fossil fuels somehow, I might be able to do that. It would take a Herculean effort. I might be able to do that. But on the other hand, it's going to have effectively zero effect on anything having to do with sustainability or climate or, the oil industry. And so that is a difficulty with my position. So when I say, individuals should take responsibility for their own moral positions and using those to affect their decisions in a market, it may well still be that there are collective action problems that can emerge because we aren't just individuals. There are 7 or I guess now 8 billion of us. And so, all those collective decisions can lead to results that even some of which, none of us individually wanted, but they emerge because of the collective action problem. That's a much more difficult issue to deal with, I think.
I've been reading a forthcoming book by John Hasnas, and he's written a lot about the power of the common law to help to solve collective action problems.
Yeah.
And, there are a lot of ways in which I think the state either impedes or maybe tips too strongly in favor of the common law in ways that are a little bit unnatural. But it is possible under the common law for individuals to bring suits against, bad business practices, fraudulent business practices, things like that, have the effect of helping to solve a collective action problem or regulating the market through civil liability in a way that's more decentralized and less prone to regulatory capture. Pretty much all fast food restaurants and coffee sellers sell their coffee at a lower temperature, essentially because of a series of lawsuits to McDonald's for people burning themselves with coffee. And maybe people think it's frivolous, and he points out that, maybe it was, but if McDonald's was following your advice and saying, if all my customers knew that we are selling coffee at a temperature that causes 3rd-degree burns apparently within 2 seconds of a spill or something, would they be happy about buying that coffee? And maybe yes, maybe no. But anyway, as a result of this lawsuit, they no longer do that, and that wasn't a legislative regulatory action. So I don't know if there are things like that with the oil industry. I know that there are liability caps with oil spills that prevent civil liability from performing this function as effectively as maybe they could in the oil industry. But that's a good answer, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to that. Look, there is no such thing as perfection. So there never will be a time when we have no problems that emerge in human society. So a former professor of mine and friend now, Richard Epstein, who was a law professor at Chicago, University of Chicago, said, in law, 95% is perfection. So if you can get to 95% of cases, that's perfection because you'll never solve the other 5% of remaining hard cases. I think something like the competitive nature of the market that we talked about before, when where you're being disciplined not just by current competitors, but by potential and future and imagined competitors on the one hand, and a civil law approach that Dennis describes and that you were just describing on the other. Those two things can get us a lot of what we want and can resolve and mitigate a lot of problems, maybe even more than the sort of top down or front end regulatory apparatus, which is itself subject to so many issues, including rent capture and others that you were just describing. What we're really looking at is what's the best among actually available alternatives, or maybe what's even the least bad among actually available alternatives. And I think just even asking that question can go a long way towards helping us think a little bit better, a little bit more reasonably about, well, should we automatically expect regulation to handle things? Should we let some things happen through the competition in the market? Should we let some things be discovered? I mean, what's the right temperature of coffee? Who knows? I mean, it's not like you can sit in your office and try to deduce from, the first principles what the right temperature of coffee is. Maybe what we do is these kinds of processes where we try this and then it leads to this problem and we get dinged because we led to that problem. So we try something else. Maybe that is the most efficient process of discovery that we have. It might be more efficient than just asking regulators to come up with something and impose that on them.
And just because we're on the topic, I want to plug to the audience Alex Epstein's book, Fossil Future, which is, I think, amazing. Do you have any recommendations for books that would complement Honorable Business?
Well, my first recommendation would be the book I believe we talked about in our other discussion, which is Seven Deadly Economic Sins. So if you have not read that, I would recommend that. There's a huge literature about business ethics, and there are many books about business ethics. Almost all of them begin with the assumption that business is bad and we got to figure out how to stop it from being bad. So I would caution people, just know that that's what you're going to get. But there are also some really good books. One that I would recommend that's a few years old now, but it still holds up pretty good is called Conscious Capitalism by John Mackey, who is the founder of Whole Foods. That book articulates an idea that it might be in a market economy in which people who do have genuine moral commitments to improving the lives of other people can most effectively and efficiently figure out what to do that would actually benefit other people. And then they get the feedback they need when they're making mistakes. And that's for people who do have genuine moral commitments. So I would recommend that book.
Awesome. By the way, I was already aware of it, but David Schmitz is the person who recommended Honorable Business to me.
My thanks to David Schmitz, great
so
friend and a great philosopher.
So what are you doing next?
Next, I'm working on a book now about human dignity. Can I give you my elevator pitch for that book?
I wish you would.
So wherever people are on the political or economic spectrum, human dignity seems to be a kind of moral North Star that everybody appeals to. In business ethics and development literature, economic development literature, and many other fields, there's this notion of human dignity as being something important. But interestingly, the uses of that term seem to go in lots of different directions, including in some cases mutually inconsistent directions. So what that tells me as someone who's trained as a philosopher is that there's something not quite right with the conception of human dignity if people think it leads to mutually inconsistent conclusions. And so in looking at it, here's the conclusion I came to, that many people are engaging in what I call volume 2 application theory. So they're just taking a view, this idea, everybody agrees that human dignity is good, and then they're just applying it to different cases without really having worked out what human dignity actually is, or what it's supposed to be, or where its prescriptive or normative content comes from. So all of those are exercises in applied philosophy about the human dignity, what I call volume 2, as if volume 1 has already been written, volume 1 about what it actually is and why we should pay attention to it and why we should care about it. So I'm attempting to write volume 1. So I'm going to try to give an account of what human dignity actually is, or what I think is the best case that can be made, or the best conception that can be developed of it, so that can help us adjudicate all these other uses that people put it to in lots of different other realms of literature and policy.
That is something I've noticed and been frustrated with in various works, an appeal to human dignity. And then I think, oh, that sounds great, but I'm not really sure what it means in this context, or if it means
Yeah.
anything other than here's a very fine sounding term, and I'm going to pin my argument on this.
Yeah, I mean, even a very simple case. Should there be a market? Should it be legal to sell one of your kidneys? Well, people defend that on grounds of human dignity, and they oppose it on grounds of human dignity. So that tells me that there's something amiss in the concept of human dignity if people can use it to defend two completely opposite positions.
Yeah. A rough release date estimate on that, or no?
I'm hoping that I will be done with the manuscript this summer, so it might be out next year. We'll see. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. And where can people find you, and where can people buy Honorable Business?
Honorable Business, you can get it at any bookstore, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's available at all those places. It's published by Oxford University Press, so you can go even to Oxford's website and buy it there. You can find more information about me and my work. I do have my own website, jamesotteson.com. Just my name, jamesotteson.com. And then I also have my website at the University of Notre Dame, where I'm a professor, and I have a lot of my work and other things there as well.
Awesome. My guest today has been James Otteson, and his book is Honorable Business, a framework for business in a just and humane society. James, thank you so much for joining me on Ideas Having Sex.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Having Sex, where we have stimulating conversations on social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you're a fan of what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.